Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to go over the concept of psychic energy. And then we're going to talk about something else that I call awakening, which we'll go over that toward the end. Right? But yeah, we're going to talk about psychic energy, which is basically just a term that I use to streamline. We're going to use that term to streamline the discussion of charging your subconscious for psychic abilities. So similar to what I did for spiritual energy. Right, so before I get into it, I'm basically just going to talk a little bit about how I came to that idea. And so when I was first developing this theory, and way back when I was using psychic abilities, at that time, so the theory definitely was not developed as much as it is now. And I thought of everything in terms of frequencies, right? So I thought everything was a frequency. So I think I mentioned it before for spiritual energy as well. I thought of connecting to God in terms of it being a frequency, right? So when I used to charge psychic abilities, I thought my subconscious, I don't know that I was fully convinced at that time that I was switching to what I would call the psychic frequency as much as it was the case for what I would used to call the God frequency. And the reason for that was because I was trying to reconcile the ability to use psychic abilities with my understanding of the subconscious mind, right? So in other words, if I have to charge my subconscious to use psychic abilities, then shouldn't I be on the frequency to do that? Because that's how I basically thought at that time for everything, right? But I didn't quite think of it as when your subconscious charges, it charges for all transcendental mental abilities, right? I didn't necessarily think of everything in terms of a transcendental mental ability at that time. However, I kind of thought that was kind of the case for psychic abilities. However, one thing I noticed was that when I would use psychic abilities, right, I never could feel any emotion, right? So I was always depressed. And so now, based on the framework that I'm setting up now, basically that's the result of losing spiritual energy, right? Because I'm doing something that is wrong. So if I use it, which there may be another caveat to that, which I'm going to talk about that later in the chapter. In other words, another cause to that, but I haven't really quite figured it out yet because I haven't really practiced this stuff yet since I turned away from it. But for now, we'll go with that and just say that I was basically sinning, so I was using psychic abilities in a way not approved by God, so my spiritual energy was dropping, which resulted in me feeling incredibly depressed. So whenever I would use psychic abilities, right, I always felt super depressed. It's like I couldn't feel any emotion. And so I used to wonder if that meant what I was doing was wrong, which it was, but I wasn't sure yet. So at one point I thought maybe the way subconscious energy works is that I can either charge it for emotion or I could charge it for psychic abilities, but I can't do both, right? So I have to sacrifice one for the other. So if I charge it for psychic abilities, I have to lose my emotion, right? So that's actually what I thought might be the case. I wasn't fully convinced of that, but I thought maybe that might be the case. Maybe that was why I felt so depressed all the time. As I charged psychic abilities more and more, I got more and more depressed, right? I had to lose my emotions more and more. Of course, like I said, that's because I was losing spiritual energy, because I was doing something that was wrong. And as I charged psychic abilities more and more, I would get more depressed. That would allow a negative entity to latch onto me more. So my emotions are telling me what I'm doing is wrong, basically. Right? But I didn't know that at the time. And so I didn't fully understand that at the time. So at that was how I looked at it back then. And I knew it wasn't quite right. It didn't quite feel right. But that was the framework I had basically around the first version of the book, which, like I said, was years ago. But as I developed the theory more and more, I was like, that doesn't quite feel right. Because now, my understanding now is that the subconscious basically expresses itself for all transcendental mental abilities at once, right? So it doesn't really make sense to say if I charge my subconscious for psychic abilities, then that has to come at the cost of emotion. No. Why isn't that the case for beliefs, right? Why isn't that the case for creativity or transcendental control, right? No, emotion comes along for the ride with all of the transcendental mental abilities, so it should be the same for this one as well, right? So that didn't quite make sense. However, when you charge your subconscious specifically, or if you're talking about subconscious energy specifically in terms of how it expresses itself for sensing through your spirit, right, which is how psychic abilities work, then we can use a new term for that type of expression of subconscious energy, which is psychic energy, right? So to go over this point, psychic energy refers to how intensely the subconscious is charged to activate the spirit's senses, right? So that's important because, like we said, your spirit senses work through what we refer to as your third eye, which is just a vehicle your spirit has to sense reality, and that your third eye or your spirit senses can be activated on a scale, right? So it's not just turned on or turned off, right? I know some sort of disciplines will say that just turn on your third eye. That doesn't make any sense. It's not really all the way turned off anyway. It's just toned down. However, when you charge your subconscious to use psychic abilities, or putting that another way, as you build up more and more psychic energy, right, your third eye becomes more and more active, or it turns on more and more and more. And so it activates on a scale. And as you charge more psychic energy, your spirit's ability to sense reality becomes more and more profound. Or you could just say it becomes more and more activated, right? So going forward, I'm just going to use the term psychic energy. So like I said, very similar to spiritual energy, right? Your subconscious energy can express itself in different ways depending on the subconscious action, right? So when it's in the form of emotion, we would call it emotional energy. We could talk about creative energy when your subconscious energy expresses itself in the form of creativity. We can even talk about it in terms of belief, like confidence, for example, or faith. When your subconscious when your subconscious energy expresses itself in the form of belief, even control, which I know is kind of a strange way of putting it, but you can even talk about control energy, right? When your subconscious expresses itself in the form of transcendental control, which that might happen when you're dancing, when you're singing, for example, or even playing sports. And then we talked about spiritual energy, which is when your subconscious expresses itself in the form of connecting to God, or when your subconscious energy expresses itself in the form of connecting to God. But also we could talk about psychic energy. And that's when your subconscious energy expresses itself in the form of sensing something in reality, or sensing something and influencing it, which we'll talk about that type of expression of subconscious energy in the next chapter. So, to go over this point, the next point, I want to now talk about the role transcendental connection plays. Right, so like I said, I think really in the beginning of the book, transcendental connection pretty much forms the basis of pretty much all supernatural phenomena, including this one. And to go over this here, it says the subconscious has the ability to transcendentally connect to a target. This connection grows as psychic energy grows. So a lot of times you'll hear psychics, people who claim to be psychic, right? I'm sure it's not always the case, but sometimes I do believe it's the case. Sometimes they'll say that they want to feel a target more, or if you want them to figure out information about some target, right? So of course it's at a distance. That's the whole point, which means they can't see it directly in the moment. They may want more information about the target, or they want like you to bring them an object or something. They want to touch the object if it's related to the target. Why are they doing that? Why do they want just something of the target to help them connect to it? It's because of transcendental connection, right? So when you're using psychic abilities in the form of sensing, your subconscious actually has to transcendentally connect to the target more, right? The more connected you are to the target, the more easily your spirit's third eye or your spirit senses will be able to pick up information about the target, right? So yeah, you basically want to transcendentally connect to whatever target you're trying to sense. The more connected you are to it, the easier you're going to be able to sense certain aspects of it, right? You're going to be able to use your psychic abilities to retrieve information about the target. There might be different ways to connect to the target. Like I said, I have not practiced psychic abilities that much, right? I practiced it years ago, never really did it again since God told me to stop. But I imagine there are different ways to connect to the target. Just thinking about, as soon as someone tells you about a target, you have the ability to sort of lock onto it through your intention. So we talked about that. That's basically a fundamental ability built into your spirit, just like emotions, free will, creativity, beliefs. the psychic abilities are built in your spirit, and one of the consequences of this ability is the ability to just connect to something really just by thinking about it. And a lot of times in NDE experiences, near-death experiences, people will report having this ability, right? They just think about someone and boom, they're usually they're there, but they're also able to retrieve information about that person. So that's how it works. Now, we have that ability, whether you're using psychic abilities or not, you always have that ability to a degree, but it's very much toned down, right? So we'll talk more about that in the next video. But your psychic abilities normally are like in a turned off state or almost turned off state. So you don't really notice it on a conscious level, but your subconscious does. Your subconscious is basically still doing that, or your spirit is still doing that, even if it's at a tiny level, which you can't really notice. It's locking on to targets just by you thinking about it. However, if you get some psychics may ask for an object from a person if they're trying to lock onto this person, and that object might help them to connect to the target more. Or if they just tell them certain things about the target, or if they go to a place where the target was, it might help them to lock onto the target more. So there are different ways to help you transcendentally connect to the target. But, like I said, the more, as psychic energy grows more and more, or the more connected you are to a target, then as you grow more psychic energy, you'll be able to sense information about that target more directly. One thing I was thinking about, which this isn't super important, this is actually something based on ideas we'll talk more about in the next chapter, but for influence type psychic abilities, in witchcraft, in the occult, a lot of times they like blood, right? They like to sacrifice some person or some animal or something, or they want blood from some person so they can do some ritual or some magic or some garbage like that. But what I think that the reason I think a lot of times they'll do that is because blood represents a life force. So, like I said, we'll talk a little more about those concepts in the next chapter. But blood is I think blood holds on to our life force a lot, or is highly connected to our life force. And so, if you can take the blood of a person, you can use it to lock onto their life force and engage in some type of spiritual attack or some type of curse or spell or whatever, which is what they use in the occult. But yeah, I think that's why they do that. That's why blood is so important in the occult and Satanism and all that crap, right? Because they want to use a spell to attack a person's life force. Of course, that doesn't work at all for a person that has a strong relationship with God, which we'll talk more about those concepts in chapter 10. But I want to mention that here. So the last thing, so I want to now talk about the concept of awakening. So I'll just go over this here. This is something I noticed. The more psychic energy you charge, the more you'll be able to use psychic abilities, even on targets you're not strongly connected to. And this is a state that I call, or a phenomenon that I call awakening, right? So just something I made up, right? But a term I made up, but this is something I have noticed in my experience, right? So in other words, what I'm saying is that when you charge, as you charge psychic energy more and more and more and more, let's say you're using it, and this is really the way you should use it for ESP. Again, you shouldn't do any of this unless you've gotten permission from God. But if you, when you focus on a particular target, right, so you lock onto that target and you use your ESP to try to retrieve information about a target, let's say it's clairvoyance, and you want to see what the target looks like, or pick up visual information, then you would continuously charge psychic energy more and more and more to sense the target. In the process of doing that, you're going to transcendentally connect to that target more and more and more, right? But this is something that I have noticed in my experience. The more I do that, even if it's for a specific target, I'll start to be able to sense other things I haven't charged a psychic energy for. I haven't charged psychic energy for and don't have a strong connection to, right? I'll notice that I just start being able to sense things. Now, that's as far as I know, that is how the third eye works. Just like your physical senses don't need to connect to anything, they just pick up information automatically. Your spirit senses, so just talking about like I said, the voluntary component of sensing, your voluntary components of sensing, although it does work better when the more connected you are to something, it can still sense pretty much anything without being connected to it as well. So I think when we're fully out of our body, or when our spirit senses fully turn on, which I only think happens in death, I think that you don't really need to connect to anything more and more, or the connection process happens so quick that it's not really a big deal. For us here, it's a big deal, so we have to increase our connection. However, that ability to still sense things without connecting, it still manifests itself to some degree as you charge more and more psychic energy. So that's something I noticed. So in other words, you'll still, as you charge psychic energy, focus on a specific target, you would still be primarily able to pick up more information about that target through your psychic abilities, but you would know a sort of a weaker ability, but you would still notice some degree of ability to sense other targets, even completely new ones, right? And you would even be able to use influence type psychic abilities as well, which is something I noticed, which we're going to talk about later in the next chapter. But just as an example, influence type psychic ability will be astral projection. So which we're not going to talk about how to do that. I know how to do that. I'm not interested in that at all. I really don't want to talk about how to do that, which if you know these ideas, then it should be pretty obvious how to do it. But suffice it to say, if you use ESP a lot, you might just notice that now you're having an easier time astral projecting, for example, right? That's a that's an influence type psychic ability. And what that is, the reason that occurs is because your spirit is entering a more awakened state. So an awakened state is really just your spirit. It's like your spirit is waking up, right? So your spirit's ability to sense reality is normally dormant or asleep, right? And so your spirit completely is dependent on your body for sending sensory information to the part of the subconscious that expresses itself in the form of sensing, right? Your subconscious instinct. It's completely dependent on your body giving it commands so that it can express some form of sensing to your conscious mind, and you're sensing reality. However, when your spirit senses start to wake up, or your third eye, it starts to wake back up, then it's no longer as dependent on your body. It starts to just be able to sense things in any way it naturally can when it's in the spirit realm. And so as your psychic energy grows more and more, your spirit senses turn on more and more. And although, like I said, you'll primarily notice it in terms of your ability to sense things about the particular target you were focused on when charging psychic energy, you would still get your spirit's ability to sense other things as well, because it's just waking up in general, right? So I call that awakening. So in other words, when you charge psychic energy at all, regardless of what the target is or what you're using it for, you're going to notice that your spirit has a natural ability to start using other psychic abilities, or using psychic abilities for other purposes and on other targets, although it'll be most sort of accurate or most clearly expressed for the target that you were focused on when charging psychic energy in the first place, because that'll be the one you're most transcendentally connected to. Right, so yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Just wanted to go over that. So, like I said, going forward, we're going to use the term psychic energy to really just basically make it easier to talk about using psychic abilities. In the next video, we're going to talk about the dampening effect. So we're going to talk about why you're not really able to, when your subconscious charges, it expresses itself in terms of all the other abilities, but not really psychic abilities. But according to what I said, subconscious energy expresses itself in all forms of your transcendental mental abilities or subconscious actions at once. So why doesn't it do it that much with psychic abilities, if that's true? So we're going to go over why that is in the next video. But that's it for now, though. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.